The version of Jericho you grew up with is incomplete, to put it mildly. We teach kids about blaring trumpets and walls tumbling down like toy blocks. But the original texts, backed by Bronze Age military doctrine, reveal a reality that is far darker and terrifying. The fall of Jericho wasn't just a physical miracle. It was a surgical strike of psychological warfare and the execution of a lethal, mathematical code. For 6 long days, the most impenetrable fortress in Canaan was slowly driven mad by the deafening silence of a marching army. And on the 7th day, the exact repetition of a single number unlocked absolute destruction. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on what military history and modern theology so often leave in the dark. The true, chilling meaning behind the 7 marches. In the ancient world, taking down a fortified city wasn't a job for amateurs. It was a grinding, ruthless mission of logic. If you flip through the military manuals of the Bronze Age or dig into the archaeological record, you see that breaching a wall required a monumental effort. Standard protocol meant building monstrous battering rams to smash through massive gates. It meant piling up immense earthen ramps under an endless rain of arrows, or enduring grueling months-long sieges just to starve out the enemy. It was a brutal game of attrition. The winner was the one who could survive the long haul. Metal pounding against stone until something finally gave way, in a predictable, exhausting cycle of bloodshed. But when Joshua stood before the massive fortifications of Jericho, the orders he received defied every known rule of military engineering. Think about the context. Here is a leader forged in the unforgiving desert, yet completely schooled in the advanced tactics of the era's most dominant empire. He knew exactly how a siege worked in the real world. So, what was the grand strategy? Not a single sword would strike the stone. Not a single soldier would scale a ladder under enemy fire. The army was simply ordered to march around the city. To any seasoned general tasked with keeping thousands of men alive, this sounded like a shortcut to absolute disaster. How do you look your battle-hardened veterans in the eye and tell them their only weapon is to shut their mouths and walk under a blistering sun? This is where the documentary record and modern excavations shine a blinding light on the mystery, tearing away that simplistic version of the past. Jericho was no defenseless village. The records reveal a formidable stronghold, a bastion shielded by a massive double-wall system designed to psych out any invading force. The outer wall sat heavily on a robust stone foundation, while the inner wall towered into the sky, creating a colossal, deadly barrier. Yet modern conflict analysis and studies of human behavior under extreme stress point to one undeniable fact. Israel's siege was anything but passive. It was the flawless execution of large-scale psychological warfare. The ultimate weapon wasn't bronze. It was the systematic breaking of the enemy's mind. Put yourself in the shoes of the sentries pacing those watchtowers. Human instinct prepared them for the chaos of combat, for war machines, screaming warriors, and a frantic assault. Instead, the guards stood paralyzed, watching a dense sea of thousands of men marching in pinpoint, terrifying choreography. It was a silence so absolute, you could hear the gravel crunching beneath thousands of leather sandals. But that silence wasn't a lack of action. It was a suffocating tension, a numerical enigma ticking away like an invisible time bomb, shredding the nerves of everyone trapped inside. What we are about to do is a critical autopsy of this day. We're going to understand exactly how the simple act of walking in silence became a death sentence, a psychological and legal collapse that imploded the fortress long before the first stone ever hit the ground. If this deep dive into history is hitting home, if you're fascinated by the hidden details that change everything, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your name down in the comments. I always want to know who's riding along with me on every step of this journey. To grasp the sheer scale of what went down on those plains of the Jordan Valley, we need to lace up the sandals of the Israelite soldiers and leave our modern mindset behind. Forget the image of a peaceful, pious, religious procession. These guys weren't monks in a state of Zen meditation. They were gritty warriors, forged in the harsh reality of the desert, led by battle-scarred commanders who knew exactly how to play the survival game. When Joshua handed down those bizarre orders, the reaction in the camp wouldn't have been a serene nod of approval. Think about the sheer insanity of this directive to a mind wired for war. The infantry was ordered to form ranks, advance on the most heavily fortified city in the region, and against all odds, just walk around it. No digging trenches, no raising shields in a defensive phalanx, no covering fire from archers. It was the equivalent of walking straight into the jaws of death, openly defying the most basic human instinct to stay alive. Jericho's defensive architecture was surgically designed to wipe out anyone foolish enough to approach without cover. That inner wall sat at the top of a steep, treacherous slope of packed earth and gravel. For the guys marching down below, it meant the defenders held the ultimate high ground. In Bronze Age military doctrine, you never deliberately expose your flank to an enemy sitting above you. But that was exactly the suicide mission demanded of the troops. With every single step across the cracked, arid earth, the men walked straight into the guards' line of sight. They could see the sharp silhouettes on the battlements, the flexing muscles of archers drawing back their bowstrings, just waiting to unleash a storm of arrows that would turn the ground into a slaughterhouse. The raw terror of marching wide open, just yards away from sudden death, required an emotional control that bordered on the superhuman. Here's a crucial detail that documentary history often lets slip right through the cracks: the painful, systematic dismantling of military pride. Joshua wasn't leading a bunch of rookie farmers. These were respected tribal warlords, commanders who knew how to hold a battle line, choke off supply routes, and set up a lethal, crushing siege. Committing to this exotic battle plan meant swallowing every ounce of combat knowledge they'd acquired in a lifetime of fighting. For a battle-hardened veteran, the most humiliating and terrifying thing in the world is to be caught in the enemy's crosshairs and given the strict order to stand down. Do not return fire. It's an agonizing test of nerves. The directive forced an immediate, brutal ego check on these leaders. They had to shelve everything they knew about logistics to pull off a maneuver that looked, smelled, and felt like tactical suicide. In that pressure cooker, submission required infinitely more grit than the courage it takes to clash swords in close-quarters combat. During that agonizing march, the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Imagine the thoughts racing through the minds of the front lines as they rounded those massive stone foundations, sweating buckets under the blistering sun, waiting for a brutal ambush that, incredibly, never came. That total lack of retaliation is the crucial piece of the puzzle. It unlocks the devastating brilliance of the strategy. Marching in disciplined silence created a massive psychological anomaly that paralyzed the defenders. The marching army was totally exposed, sitting ducks, but the movement was so radically off-script from any known playbook of war that it completely short-circuited the enemy's response. The human mind is deeply terrified of what it cannot decode. The sheer absence of a frontal assault shredded the nerves of Jericho in a way no battering ram ever could. This trek wasn't some casual tactical stroll through the valley. It was a deliberate, total collapse of every paradigm for the men on the outside. This seemingly absurd order was designed to strip away every ounce of self-reliance they had in their own physical strength. The strategy transformed proud, dominant warriors into vulnerable targets, exposing them to imminent doom for one reason: to establish an unquestionable fact. The traditional logic of warfare had been suspended on those plains. From that exact second onward, their greatest weapon wasn't brute force. It was the iron discipline to keep putting one foot firmly in front of the other, crushing absolutely every instinct to fight or flee. Now, let's flip the lens. Transport yourself inside the claustrophobic corridors and heavily guarded walls of Jericho. The Canaanite population, toughened by the brutal survival dynamics of the ancient Near East, was locked, loaded, and fully prepped for a massive frontal assault. They had stockpiled rations, reinforced the heavy iron locks on the massive gates, and positioned their elite snipers along the parapets. The sheer anticipation of combat triggers an adrenaline dump, nature's painkiller, prepping a soldier's body to fight or die trying. When the watchtowers finally sounded the alarm that the massive Israelite camp was on the move, the entire fortress held its breath. Pure logic dictated they were about to hear the blood-curdling roar of war machines, the war cries of charging infantry, and the earth-shattering impact of the vanguard. But what actually unfolded was a terrifying choreography that completely short-circuited the minds of the Canaanite strategists. It tore apart the mental fabric of the city long before it scratched a single stone. The charge never came. The battle cry never echoed. In place of all-out aggression, the enemy deployed a weapon far more refined and unforgiving: the psychological torture of absolute silence. To truly grasp the devastating impact of this move, you have to understand how the human mind operates under acute, prolonged stress. From a psychiatric and military standpoint, the endless anticipation of a fatal blow is often far more destructive than the blow itself. By marching without launching a single arrow, Joshua's leadership robbed Jericho of the one thing that helps a defender keep it together: the clarity of an immediate threat. Thousands upon thousands of warriors, locked in disciplined formation, lapped the perimeter of the fortress in a silence so deep, so funeral-like, it bordered on the supernatural. No trash talk, no clashing of swords against bronze shields, no taunts, just the harsh, rhythmic, inescapable grinding of thousands of souls, crushing the dry gravel of the plain. That relentless friction of footsteps acted as a phantom countdown, a macabre ticking clock, marking a time bomb that the defenders had zero idea when would go off. As the days dragged on, the pent-up tension in the guard towers hit suffocating levels. Put yourself in the armor of a veteran sentry. You've got the enemy exactly where you want them, totally exposed on the low ground, lacking any overhead cover. It was a golden ticket to unleash an epic defensive massacre. And yet, a paralyzing dread, born purely from the unknown, kept anyone from even thinking about giving the order to fire. The anomaly of that endless march was so bizarre, so completely alien to the military manuals of the day, that it triggered a total cognitive blackout across the defense grid. And to make a terrifying situation drastically worse, the dead silence of the troops was randomly, unpredictably pierced by the sharp, grating, bone-chilling blast of the shofar, the traditional ram's horn trumpet. That lone, piercing wail tearing through the desert air wasn't calling for a troop advance. It was a surgical strike, a siren of absolute terror, constantly reminding the trapped inhabitants that this wasn't just a military parade, it was a death warrant being drafted in real time. The blast of the shofar cut straight through solid stone walls. It bled into the dark rooms of their homes, destroying any hope of rest or sanity. With every new dawn, the sadistic cycle started all over again, repeatedly hijacking their survival instincts and pushing an entire city right to the razor's edge of a mental breakdown. This deeply unsettling game, executed with ice-cold precision, wasn't a sign of weakness or cowardice. It was the ultimate weaponized application of mental attrition. The entire city was taken hostage by relentless suspense. Stripped of a direct physical confrontation to burn off that tension, the sheer terror of not knowing what was coming morphed into rampant, collective paranoia. The rulers and officers, once feeling invincible behind their ancient stones, now watched the morale of their people literally evaporate into the desert heat, day after day. The lack of physical aggression created a vacuum for an invisible, merciless assault that eroded unit cohesion, broke their fighting spirit, and sparked pure panic long before the final showdown. The so-called impregnable fortress was rapidly rotting from the inside out. It was being eaten alive by the brutal exhaustion of trying to solve a deadly puzzle that marched right past its front door every single morning, just waiting to call checkmate. You know, if we don't want to be fooled by people who try to twist history, it is absolutely critical to understand the exact timeline of how biblical events actually went down. With that in mind, I put together something really special for you. A practical, easy-to-read digital ebook that lays out the entire Bible in chronological order, from Genesis straight through to Revelation. It's a simple, engaging way to keep the backstage of the scriptures right in your pocket. The link to check it out is right down below, pinned in the top comment. As soon as this video wraps up, do yourself a favor and take a look. I know you're going to love the read. But right now, I need you to stay locked in. Pay close attention to this next part. We've finally hit the massive blind spot of this story. The surgical detail that flashy theology and shallow documentaries love to sweep under the rug. When we look at the heavy emphasis on the number 7 during the Siege of Jericho, the knee-jerk reaction is to write it off as cheap numerology. People say 7 represents perfection, the closing of a cosmic cycle, and they call it a day. The explanation usually stops dead right there, leaving this vague, empty mysticism hanging in the air that frankly doesn't satisfy anyone looking for the hard facts. But we are diving way beneath the surface. If you analyze the linguistics of the ancient Near East and the hardcore legal structures of Bronze Age Semitic tribes, you stumble onto something infinitely heavier. This obsessive repetition of the number 7 had absolutely nothing to do with superstition. It was the strict execution of a hidden code, a binding, definitive legal signature being stamped into the dirt with every single footstep. To crack this ancient documentary cipher, we have to dig into the roots of biblical Hebrew. The exact word used for the number 7 is Sheva. But here is where the massive paradigm shift happens. The etymological root of Sheva is the exact same root word used for swearing an oath or sealing an unbreakable covenant. In the legal mindset of that ancient world, when two parties wanted to lock down an ironclad contract, transfer the deed to a piece of property, or guarantee a promise under the penalty of death, that person literally severed themselves. It was the equivalent of standing in the public square and declaring, "I place myself under the absolute authority and judgment of the 7. So, when a military force is ordered to march 7 laps, and on the 7th day repeat the process 7 times, backed by 7 priests blasting 7 shofars, let's be crystal clear. This was no physical warm-up for the troops. What was actually going down on those sun-baked plains of the Jordan Valley was the establishment of an open-air tribunal. Every complete lap the infantry walked around Jericho was the ancient equivalent of reading an irrevocable contract clause out loud. With every synchronized step, Israel wasn't just flexing its military muscle. Strictly from the standpoint of ancient law, they were filing the ultimate deed to that real estate. It was a diplomatic and spiritual power play of epic proportions. The city was actively changing hands in the unseen, legal realm long before a single hairline fracture appeared in the stone. Just think about the bitter irony of the scene. The Canaanite warlords, locked up tight inside, thought they were staring down some eccentric military siege, when, in reality, they were watching their own eviction notice being drafted in the desert dust. It is totally fascinating to see how this technical proof completely destroys the childish idea that the whole thing was just some freak acoustic phenomenon. The Fall of Jericho was a brutal two-front assault. First, the psychological warfare that absolutely shredded the sanity of the men behind the walls. Second, the relentless legal warfare that stripped the local inhabitants of their claim to the region. To the original ancient audience who read these texts thousands of years ago, the message was loud and clear. They didn't need a translator to understand what was happening. They knew that the number 7 was the heavy gavel of the judge slamming down on the desk. By the time the 7th lap of the 7th day wrapped up, the contract was signed in blood. The land had a new, legal owner, universally recognized by the ruthless covenant codes of the Middle East. All that was left was the brutal, physical execution of the eviction order. This completely changes how we view the iron discipline of those troops, walking in dead silence under the boiling sun. They were active participants in a spiritual notary public. The Wall of Jericho didn't crash down because a sound wave magically hit the perfect resonant frequency. It collapsed under the crushing weight of a sacred oath. The driving force of that cataclysm wasn't just gravity. It was the ultimate authority of a legal code that traditional military history still struggles to understand today. The dawn of the 7th day brought a violent shift to the dynamics of the siege, completely shattering the slow, methodical pace of the previous week. For 6 days, the psychological torture of Jericho was built on a single daily lap around the walls. It was grueling, sure, but it kept the troops within an acceptable physical limit. But when the sun broke over the Jordan Valley on that final morning, the new orders demanded absolutely everything left in the tanks of those men. The logistics for Day 7 dictated 7 full laps under the punishing, unforgiving heat of the Middle East. For an infantry unit pushing through rough terrain, it was a physical grind that bordered on total, dangerous exhaustion. The topography ringing the fortress was incredibly rugged, littered with loose gravel, and choked by a suffocating cloud of dust kicked up by every synchronized footstep. Hiking the perimeter of Jericho 7 consecutive times meant holding total military discipline while in a state of borderline physical delirium. Cottonmouth, muscles screaming on fire, and the never-ending, nerve-wracking reality of being in the enemy's crosshairs turned that march into a visceral, agonizing test of endurance. And the wildest part? The vow of silence had to be maintained without a single crack. All that primal aggression, born out of intense pain and discomfort, had to be swallowed whole. Every ounce of human instinct was vacuum-sealed inside each soldier, turning the entire army into a massive pressure cooker, ticking inches away from a catastrophic structural failure. When that brutal final lap finally came to an end, the march stopped dead in its tracks. The dust settled, and for a split second, the heaviest, most suffocating silence of the entire campaign swallowed the plain. And then, the frozen inertia of war shattered with terrifying violence. Joshua gave the signal, and the blast of the shofars ripped through the air in one continuous, deafening roar. The blast of the trumpets wasn't some majestic melody. It was a harsh, violently piercing frequency that sliced right through the atmosphere. It was the exact signal thousands of men were desperate for. The sheer contrast between a full week of dead silence and the absolute chaos that followed defies human comprehension. The violent release of all that pent-up tension erupted into one massive, simultaneous, gut-wrenching roar. This battle cry wasn't just disorganized screaming. It was a raw, cathartic explosion of exhaustion, sheer terror, and the nuclear adrenaline of an entire army letting it rip. That massive wall of sound fused perfectly with the ear-splitting blast of the trumpets, slamming into the morale and the physical foundations of the city like a freight train. The collapse of the massive walls synchronized perfectly with this unbelievable climax of exhaustion and release. The shockwave that buried Jericho alive didn't just come from the horns of animals. It was violently ripped from the lungs of warriors who had been pushed to the absolute breaking point of human endurance. The physical war had begun the exact microsecond the silence died. When the thick, choking dust of that structural collapse finally started to settle, and the screams of pure panic completely replaced the funeral silence of the plain, the true, terrifying reality of the 7 laps was finally exposed. The monumental fall of Jericho's walls didn't represent the heroic Hollywood ending of a siege. It was merely the prelude to one of the most ruthless, systemic, and widely misunderstood military executions in all of antiquity. If you flip through standard military history textbooks, you'll see that a city of that massive size, dripping with wealth and parked on a highly strategic oasis, would naturally be treated as the ultimate spoil of war. Standard Bronze Age procedure meant soldiers would kick in the gates, loot the gold, drag off prisoners for slave labor, and confiscate the massive grain silos to feed the army for years of future campaigns. But Jericho was no ordinary conquest, and under absolutely no circumstances was it going to suffer an ordinary sack. The entire city was placed under the heavy, inescapable law of the harem. To our modern minds, the concept of total annihilation sounds like irrational, bloodthirsty barbarism. But inside the complex legal and spiritual code of the ancient Near East, the harem, the ban, the absolute consecration of a city for total destruction, operated under a strict, unyielding logic. Remember that invisible legal signature stamped into the gravel with every silent lap? That relentless ritual didn't just transfer the deed to the land in the spiritual realm, it officially consecrated the entire structure of Jericho as the untouchable firstfruits of the Canaanite invasion. In ancient Hebrew tradition, the first harvest of the land never belonged to the guy swinging the sickle. It was completely surrendered and sacrificed back to the deity who guaranteed the success of the mission. Jericho was exactly that, the very first bloody fruit of war. The army of Israel was strictly forbidden from making a single dime off the ashes of that fortress. That lethal order was hammered deep into the minds of the troops long before the first sword ever tasted blood. Every single ounce of gold, silver, bronze, and iron pulled from the rubble wouldn't be divvied up among the generals, and it sure wouldn't be melted down to forge new weapons. It was to be meticulously gathered and carried straight to the untouchable treasury of the tabernacle. It was the raw, upfront payment of a brutal covenant. Any soldier who dared to stash a piece of fine cloth or silver under his tent would be violently tearing up the contract they just spent 7 days signing, instantly dragging a death sentence right into his own camp. What unfolded next was a tactical cleansing operation that spared absolutely no one. With the sole famous exception of Rahab's bloodline, a strictly negotiated addendum to the contract, sworn under oath, that was surgically respected right in the eye of the hurricane. The extinction of all life inside those walls operated, on the ground, like a total urban holocaust. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't some blind, uncontrollable rage from exhausted soldiers blowing off steam. after a week of psychological torture. It was the cold, methodical, and devastating execution of an uncompromising spiritual clause. Just think about the sheer insane level of discipline required to pull off a maneuver like that. The ancient soldier fought for the shining promise of the loot. Plunder was the hard-earned paycheck for staring death in the face. To command thousands of rugged, bleeding men to walk over mountains of wealth, stepping right over Canaanite jewels without putting a single piece in their pockets, was a total violation of human nature in war. But the sheer terror imposed by that silent code was so crushing that the troops operated like a scalpel, extinguishing life while preserving the precious metals strictly for the sacred. Human greed was totally silenced by the absolute dread of the anathema. The surviving Canaanites locked in the neighboring city-states, paralyzed as they watched dense columns of black smoke rising over the valley horizon, received a massive political and military message that chilled the entire region to the bone. Israel hadn't crossed the Jordan River to collect taxes, negotiate trade routes, or set up a tribute system. They were acting as the ruthless executors of a non-negotiable eviction notice. The harem guaranteed that this formidable metropolis was literally erased from existence, turning its burned foundations into a perpetual monument of horror. That cataclysmic event cemented, in blood and fire, the brutal reality that history's most savage conflicts do not end when the wall finally hits the dirt. They end the exact second the final drop of the contract is paid in full. When we stare out across the vastness of the Jordan Valley today, the dusty ruins of Jericho hold the silent echo of one of the darkest, most fascinating lessons in all of human history. For decades, we've been conditioned to view this event through an infantilized lens, reducing a masterclass in psychological and legal warfare down to a magic trick about loud trumpets and tumbling blocks. But a hardcore, critical analysis of ancient documents and a deep understanding of Bronze Age siege tactics force us to face a reality that is infinitely harder and more complex. Those 7 laps around the untouchable fortress were never, for a single second, about testing the physical load-bearing strength of ancient masonry. And they certainly weren't about magically finding an acoustic frequency to shake the walls apart. The true engineering behind this conquest was leaps and bounds more sophisticated. It was a dual-threat operation meticulously designed to absolutely annihilate the mental foundations on both sides of the battlefield before a single sword was ever drawn from its sheath. On one side of the line, the silent march was the exact agonizing instrument needed to break the military pride of Israel's generals. Hardened men of war were forced to swallow their survival tactics, drop their shields, and march wide open, learning the hard way that true victory required unconditional submission to a command that defied all human logic. On the other side of the wall, that methodical unpredictability worked like a lethal poison, snapping the minds of the enemy in half. The sheer terror of unbroken silence, the endlessly frustrated anticipation of an attack, and the complete lack of any recognizable pattern totally corroded the sanity and the morale of the people who thought those stones would keep them safe. The invasion of Jericho actually happened way before the 7th day. The city was breached and swallowed whole by absolute paralyzing panic. The ultimate takeaway from this monumental ritual is that the deadliest battles don't actually kick off the moment steel strikes steel. They begin the exact microsecond fear takes root in the heart, and the mind finally caves to the crushing pressure of the unknown. Pride crumbled long before the bedrock did. The formidable wall of Jericho didn't collapse because of the mechanical impact of a sound wave or some highly convenient, localized earthquake. It was literally crushed under the staggering weight of an invisible covenant code, An uncompromising legal and spiritual signature that traditional military history, with all its textbooks and maps, still tries in vain to plot out today. By silencing the voices of thousands of hardened soldiers, that day forced history itself to scream one unchangeable truth. The most impenetrable fortresses on Earth aren't built with bricks. They are built with arrogance. And there is not a single structure in the world capable of standing against the final execution of a sentence that has already been signed.